This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, producer of the show. On today's episode, Mike and David are joined by Matt Giani, professor and researcher at the University of Texas at Austin and author of Fordham's new report, Calculus or Statistics, Does It Matter? The study explores how advanced math course taking impacts college and career outcomes and finds there's no one-size-fits-all path for success. Then, on the Research Minute, Amber shares a study examining whether Indiana's statewide private school voucher program has had any competitive effects on public school student outcomes. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming this week's special guest, Matt Giani. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Matt is a professor and researcher at the University of Texas at Austin, also the author of a new Fordham study, which we will be talking about in a moment. But first, let's welcome in my co-host, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Matt. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, Matt, this study, as we were saying, has been a long time in the making. It's a really exciting one with decades of data, an ability to look at long-term findings. Let's talk all about it in Ed Reform Update. All right. Well, we'll cut the suspense. The new study is called Calculus or Statistics. Does it matter? I love it in that this is a very practical question. Students right now may be deciding what math class to take in high school, and this study might help them make that decision. You mentioned that this is personal to you. Why is that?
That's true. I was one of the types of students that's kind of in the sample, in the data, and also the type of student we're thinking about in this report. I took algebra in middle school, had the opportunity to choose either statistics or calculus in high school, and I had gotten really turned off with math by the time I was a sophomore or junior. So by that point, I decided to go with statistics, and eventually studied English in college, didn't pursue a math discipline. I think I took one math course in college that was very kind of rudimentary math and assumed that was the end of my math career. And then, of course, eventually completed my PhD, wanted to be an educational researcher, specialized in advanced quantitative methods, and now I teach statistics to people who want to study education. So I kind of thought math wasn't for me by the time I was midway through high school. And I think taking statistics was really the seed that took some years to germinate. But really, it's defined my career. I really define myself as a quantitative researcher who uses statistics in my day-to-day life. And I think there's a lot of students out there that have the opportunity to take calculus, but maybe think it's not a good fit for them, don't seem excited by it, don't know how they'd use it in their specific career interests. And hopefully our study sheds some light on the viability of statistics as an alternative path for students like them.
I love it. All right. Very good. You had me nervous there for a minute, though, Matt, when I was thinking, oh, my God, we had an English professor do this very heavy statistical study for us. David, what are we thinking? Okay, good. That had a happy ending. All right. Well, tell us about this study. You follow a bunch of cohorts of kids over a long time to try to look at how students do who either take basically AP statistics versus AP Calc AB, right? Anything we should know about the sample and the what you're looking at, but then let's get to the punchline as soon as we can. What do we find out?
Yeah, so a couple findings just about the kind of spread of statistics overall, which I think are really important to contextualize the study. We do document that statistics has grown in popularity, both in terms of schools offering the course and students taking it, to the point where statistics essentially overpassed calculus in terms of the percentage of high school graduates who take either course by the end of our study. So there really has been a pretty dramatic shift in the math course taking. And the Texas findings really mirror some national trends in that regard. So the question, of course, is like, is this a good thing? Or are we diverting students who could succeed in calculus into a lower quality pathway that maybe isn't as rigorous, which is one of the concerns expressed by many about the growth in statistics. And I think our findings are really nuanced. We do find some evidence that taking calculus is related to subsequent post-secondary outcomes, particularly when we're comparing calculus versus statistics. So for example, calculus students are more likely to enroll in selective colleges. They're more likely to major in STEM. When they get to college, they're more likely to earn a STEM degree. So you might look at those findings and say, oh, wow, there really is an advantage of calculus. But on many other really important outcomes, we don't see the same difference. And even in some outcomes, we see that statistics students have an advantage. So for example, when we look at baccalaureate attainment, we find no difference between students who take calculus or statistics, which is interesting once again, because calculus students are more likely to enroll in selective colleges. And you might think, well, those are the colleges that are best able to support students' baccalaureate attainment. And yet we find no differences between statistics and calculus students in baccalaureate attainment. Similarly, we find that calculus students have that STEM advantage, right? They're more likely to major in STEM, they're more likely to earn a STEM degree. But then when we look at long-term earnings differences, we find minimal difference between students who took calculus and students who took statistics. So we think of these STEM occupations, these STEM fields, as being very lucrative, in demand, so on and so forth. So why might it be that calculus is promoting STEM enrollment and attainment, but not necessarily promoting long-term earnings more than statistics? And we find that people who take statistics are going into many other important fields, right? They're in finance, they're in IT, they're in other industries that are still very lucrative, very in demand, even though they didn't necessarily pursue the STEM path. So overall, there's just a lot of nuance in these findings, and there's not really one clear winner, right? It's not like calculus is clearly superior to statistics or vice versa. I think it really depends. And at the end of the day, it probably depends on the student, his or her interests, his or her aspirations. And there might be different best choices for different students, right? Which hopefully the lack of a kind of cut and dry winner is actually some solace to folks who might be like wrestling with this decision. I don't think there's necessarily a wrong choice for a lot of students.
No, this is great. And you mentioned, Matt, look, that a lot of us have been worried about pushing kids, especially advanced students, away from calculus towards what we're seeing as less rigorous courses of study. And that this is part of the push for so-called equity, that, you know, it's almost felt like a shortcut, right? Rather than do the hard work of getting more kids ready for advanced math like calculus, well, we'll just make math easier and then we'll feel better about the fact that the gaps aren't as big. But here, what you're looking at is, again, calculus versus, for the most part, AP statistics, right? So this is still an advanced math course, but it's a different set of math skills. And as you say, it might be more applicable to more of those non-STEM careers. Now, not only is this study important for students, but let's face it, it's also for college admissions departments. I just got back from doing the college tour with my high school junior. And, we're going to a lot of very selective universities, looking at them, and they all say, hey, if you want to get in here, one thing we look at your transcript. We want to see that you're taking the toughest courses that your high school offers. Well, that sends this message to these students that, well, then I guess I got to take that calculus class. And so not surprisingly, that message has been heard by students gunning for those selective colleges and those STEM careers. If maybe some of the students that are not going into STEM at those highly selective colleges could be doing statistics instead and getting more out of it, we need to get the admissions departments to make it clear that, hey, we would just be just as happy to see AP statistics on your transcript as AP calculus. David, what else do you think in terms of implications, in terms of what this study means for students or for colleges or for high schools?
Yeah, I I have a bunch of questions, but let me just articulate my philosophical position first. I am dovish on this. I am sort of skeptical that truly advanced students are being permanently diverted from exciting opportunities in, splicing genes or designing solar panels or whatever, because they don't take, because they don't take calculus in high school instead of statistics. There is such a thing as college. And, if you don't take one, you can go back and take the other. And my impression is actually, and maybe Matt can set me right here, but as someone who ultimately took both, my sense is that's actually fairly common. Am I right on that front?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, right. So I guess I'm sort of skeptical at that level. I also think it's totally natural, given the way that the world is changing, to see more people taking statistics, right? Because the way that, the sort of parabola that's traced by a ball that's bouncing hasn't changed in the last 20 years, right? But the volume of data that we are wrangling in the real world has increased by, I don't even know how many orders of magnitude. It's almost impossible to keep up, and you'd be crazy not to know a little bit of statistics in this environment. And that kind of brings me to my third point, which is totally non-research based, and will probably make our erstwhile math reviewers angry. But I have sort of a hunch or a personal feeling that statistics could even have sort of, I don't want to call them like social returns, right? But I think people use statistics in everyday discourse and in political discourse in a way that that calculus isn't necessarily used. And that doesn't, I don't want to sort of suggest that I think it's, people should stop taking calculus, because that's not what I'm saying. But I do think that when you are reading a news story and it involves statistics in some way, which it often does, it helps to understand things like statistical significance, right? Or correlation, in a way that it's understanding sort of the second derivative doesn't necessarily help. So I have sort of a soft civicsy, preference or sense that actually statistics is part of your broader education increasingly, in a way that maybe calculus even isn't. So those are my philosophical commitments. I have a bunch of questions, which I don't know if we have time for. My main one is just, Mike says no. All right, I have one question. Can you just, at a descriptive level, can you help us understand? So, there's this sort of gut feeling that maybe this is not as high, sort of as rigorous a course, or at least that the students who are going into it are not necessarily as strong, which are two different things, right? Can you just help us understand, is that in fact the case? Are the kids who are going into statistics, I guess, to get there, obviously you have to make it through, I think, still something resembling Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, at least that was what we called it in my day. Is it fair to say that the kids are who are going into statistics maybe didn't do quite as well in those courses, or do we not know?
We do know, and they're very similar. AP calculus students might have slightly higher test scores when we look at like 8th grade reading and math tests, and we have a figure of the report that shows that. But generally, both students are about 0.5 standard deviations above average, which is like, considerably above average. And to take either course, generally, you have to take algebra in middle school, which already puts you on the advanced path in most states. Some states have tried like mandatory algebra in middle school, but in Texas, that's not the case. So you have to take algebra in middle school, usually geometry in 9th grade, algebra 2 in 10th grade, pre-calculus in 11th grade. And then there's kind of the fork in the road, right? Of do you take AP statistics or do you take AP calculus? So that's kind of the typical student that we're focused on. So these are very high achieving students. In terms of our main analyses, kind of estimating the difference between AP statistics and AP calculus AB. The one caveat I'd say is that we also have this regular statistics, the non-AP statistics, which we don't evaluate the effectiveness of that course in the same way that we're kind of estimating the effect of AP statistics. But that course has become very popular very recently. It's really since 2015 when that course took off. And there have even been some state policy changes that seem to allow substitutions of regular statistics in lieu of Algebra 2. So that's become a really novel path that has also coincided with the kind of shift from college readiness and focusing on preparing all students for a four-year college to a shift to college and career readiness and allowing more career and technical education options, more pathways directly aligned with technical programs or the labor market. And we see the rise in regular statistics at that time. We see very different characteristics of students in regular statistics and AP statistics. So that's like a really big divergence still. And I think we need a lot more research on that regular statistics path. But I'm with you. I just see what's changing in society and the growing importance of statistics, probability, quantitative reasoning. And it seems like those skills are super important, like no matter what you do, both like professionally and socially, when just having conversations and engaging in public discourse on important issues. So I'm heartened to see that growth in regular statistics as well, even though those don't tend to be the kind of advanced math kids who are the ones taking either AP calculus or AP statistics towards the end of high school.
And so really the next study then, Matt, needs to be to go and look at, say, that lower level statistics class versus an Algebra 2 and look at the long-term outcomes. I mean, look, I love the ability to do this because as we've been talking about here on this show, there's not enough time in any kid's schedule to do everything. And so if we want, for example, more kids to be able to do high quality career tech where they're actually on a work site or doing a lot of community college, CTE stuff, maybe apprenticeships even, they don't have time to necessarily take 4 years of math, 4 years of English. And so we have to make space for them in that, in that schedule. But every state has all of these course requirements, in some cases for good reasons. In some cases, I think because some random legislator wakes up one day and says, wouldn't it be great if everybody took a year of health in high school, right? That happened in Maryland. It used to be half a year in high school after they took, health, a quarter of health throughout middle school. I mean, these kids know health. Trust me. And, or it's financial literacy, or it's whatever, it's coding, it's whatever the next thing is. And suddenly these kids' schedules are all kludged up and they don't have time to do some of the other higher valued things. But we can test this. Maybe it's the case that financial literacy is really high value added. Let's figure that out. Maybe the statistics course is actually too low level. And what we're doing is we're lowering the bar. We need to know that as well. So these kinds of studies are super important. So I'm glad that you are doing them. Let's do more of them.
Sounds good. And I'll also just shout out another report that y'all are releasing looking at these math pathways in the New England area, which I had a chance to review recently. And I think one of the recommendations in that report was really, really important, which is that we need to have really clear and rigorous standards for what students should be learning in these courses. There's the case in California where there was a push to have data science in lieu of, I believe, Algebra 2. And that was allowed in university admissions in the A through G system, or however UC does its admissions, until 2024, when basically there was a revolt against the data science course because it was perceived as not as rigorous and students weren't coming into the universities with the same skills. We don't want to have that situation, right? So I think we need to have clear standards. We need to ensure that there's rigor in the curriculum. We need to ensure that teachers have the training they need to teach at a high level. And once we have those things in place, then the question is, okay, is this better than the alternative, right? And we need to have more experimental and quasi-experimental research that can suss that out, because it is really difficult to kind of navigate the trade-offs. If you add something, you got to cut something else because students have a limited amount of time. So thanks for the opportunity to do this type of research. Hopefully it's important to the field.
All right, great. Thanks again, Matt Giani at the University of Texas. And check out the new Fordham study of his, Calculus or Statistics, Does It Matter? And now it's time for everyone's favorite, Amber's Research Minute. Amber, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, so we spent last week in the Petrilli family touring colleges in the Northeast with our junior in high school, Nico.
Yes.
And of course, on my mind was I recently wrote about how politically or ideologically diverse college campuses are, including the selective ones. This was, of course, this is on my mind because we're doing all this college searching and helping him make this big choice. And, not surprisingly, the most selective colleges tend to skew way to the left in terms of, students identifying themselves as liberal versus conservative. I gotta say, these colleges, when they're doing their tours and things, not helping to make conservatives necessarily feel welcome.
Uh-oh, what was said?
All right, you know what it is? They all start, all of them, with the land acknowledgement.
Okay.
Have you witnessed the land
Who was
acknowledgement?
taken from? Yes.
Yes.
I have not witnessed it.
What's that?
I have not witnessed it.
You have not? Really?
I have read about it. No, I have not.
Oh my gosh. What circles are you in? I feel like I've seen this so many times.
We're in a fully virtual world, Mike. My kitchen and my living room.
All right. Well, this is, of course, where an organization makes notice of the fact that they are on land that was taken from a particular Native American tribe. Now, look, I will say, if it's relevant, then it feels a little bit better. So Dartmouth, I didn't know this, was founded as a school for Native Americans. So that's relevant. And they acknowledged they didn't actually fulfill that mission hardly at all or very well at all for many, many years. That I don't mind. But if it's just randomly, it just feels like a way to kind of poke your eye in people that are not part of the coastal elite. I will now end my speech on that.
Yes, it is interesting. I'm sure you heard that at UVA as well.
Oh, yes. UVA was very sure to tell us about.
Yes, indeed. So I understand.
Yeah. All right. But now to the Research Minute, I understand we have an exciting one this week.
We do. I think it is. It is from Anna Egalite and Andrew Catt, and they are looking at the competitive effects of Indiana Choice Scholarship Program on the outcomes of public school students. So this is pretty cool. This is the first study to look at the non-participants. So it's this question of, does a rising tide lift all boats? And if so, do those outcomes differ by subgroups? And is there a tipping point by which you increase these student transfers so much that will predict the changes in the student outcomes at the nearby public district schools? Okay. The first to look, I already said that, at non-participants. A prior matching study, just quick mention, found no effect on reading and a small negative effect on math for participants, just to kind of put that context out there for the participant work. And then let me give you some context on the program. I think most of our listeners will know, but just in case, it's the largest statewide private school voucher program in the country. Has an 22-23, they had 53,000 kids participating. That's been, I'll say in a minute, that's been increased. Launched in 2011, it's seen a 10-fold increase in participation as eligibility has continued to expand over time. Over the years, they've added the kindergarten kids, they added the siblings of the voucher participants, they added the kids with special needs, and they added those zoned to failing schools. And in 23-24, it amounted to 6% of all Indiana public and private school students who were receiving vouchers. So it was up to 71,000 kids. And then back in the time that the study was done, it was households where the family income did not exceed 150% of the maximum qualifying income for free and reduced lunch, which equated to about 61,000 for a family of four. Again, most of our listeners may know the program is now nearly universal. Indiana also requires that students be tested on the state test and that their results be reported, and that private schools have to agree to have their curriculum reviewed, and they have to agree to classroom observations and a bunch of other stuff. So there is quite a decent level of transparency and accountability in Indiana. All right, their sample includes 2.4 million observations of 883 unique students from 2006-7 through 2015-16. Okay, so that's important. So it's not super up to date in terms of today, but it stops at 2016. They use a difference in differences design, have student fixed effects, they have cohort, grade by year fixed effects. They're looking at the difference between schools facing differing levels of competitive pressure. So the idea is that some schools with a lower level of competitive pressure from private schools form a good counterfactual for schools with higher levels of competition. And then they measure competition by the drive time between the district school and the nearest private school competitor. So it's not from the kid's house, it's from the district school and the nearest private school. It's typically measured in 10-minute increments or less. They can get it down to 1 minute as well, but 10 minutes is usually how they report. Charter schools are not included. So they are only estimating effects for kids in traditional district schools. We can come back to that in the discussion if you want. And bottom line, they found largely null effects on math and ELA achievement, on students' probability of graduating as well. So null effects sort of everywhere they looked. In other words, there's no evidence that increased private school competition was associated with decreases in student achievement in Indiana's traditional public schools in the program's first year of operation, when you had about 4,000 kids transferred to the private sector. And then they said, okay, well, maybe there's, when we have more kids, maybe it'll make a difference. But they didn't find impacts either in the later years when you had as many as 32,000 kids participating. So that tipping point thing they were looking into didn't pan out. They actually didn't see differences relative to participation levels. And then they looked at subgroups and they found like a couple small statistically significant differences. But once they adjusted, because they did a bunch of tests, once they adjusted for multiple hypotheses, those went away. And same thing happened again when they looked at the graduation impacts. There was a small benefit for kids who were in high poverty district schools, and then that disappeared after the first year of policy implementation. So, a lot of these things are just kind of going away once they, do more rigorous testing in the analysis. And then finally, they end up saying, these findings seem to alleviate concerns of choice opponents who, in fact, may be worried about the negative effect for kids who are not choosing to go and participate in the program.
Well, I agree with that spin. in that it is true that is the strongest argument opponents of choice have, right? We know that holds well. If you say this private school choice program, this voucher program is going to hurt public schools, then you will get more people to be opposed to it. And that's just not true. But it is a little disappointing that this finding was null in that, tell me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of the other voucher studies and charter school studies have tended to find some positive effects from competition on traditional public schools. Maybe null to positive, but this is certainly, there certainly are some others that have found more positive results. And so here you have a program that is having slightly negative impacts on the participants and null impacts on the traditional public school kids who do not participate. That's not great. And let me acknowledge that, as you said, Indiana has a lot of the things that we at Fordham would like to see, like testing for everybody and a lot of transparency. And yet the results, pretty mediocre.
Yeah, I agree, Mike. I think here's where my head's at with it, right? So I think it has always been dangerous for school choice proponents to rely on competitive effects as kind of a get out of jail free card, right? Like it's nice to think that schools compete with each other, et cetera, and maybe they do under some circumstances in a way that's beneficial. But if you just take this result at face value, right, our primary concern and the most natural concern of most people is how are the kids who are participating in the program doing? And if they're not doing well, then something needs to be done about that. I am a little disappointed. I'm not shocked. I'll just say, I have the same reading of the research that you do, right? The voucher research, the voucher-based research on competition has always been a little more positive than the charter-based research. And I've never been sure whether to believe that, right? You can imagine reasons why charters might be more disruptive, right? If you drop an entire school in a district, right, that might be different than taking a few kids out of the district. But you can also imagine other reasons why those literatures might differ. And so, I'm not shocked, right? At least on the charter side, the null result is almost as common as the positive result, right? And the positive effects tend to be really small. And let's just say it, it's really difficult to study this stuff, right? So, it never shocks us, right? When we find that seemingly positive results are smaller than we want, or that they go away under some circumstances. So none of that shocks me. I agree with your pushback, right? Which is basically, I don't have a whole lot of answers, right? Like if the sort of supports for the market that have been put in place in Indiana aren't working, I think we have to ask ourselves why, right? Obviously, it's just one state. We have more positive research coming out of places like Florida, et cetera, right? But I think, I think it's a challenging result for those of us who think this is a sort of a compelling theory of action, right? And we need to figure out, what do we need to be doing differently?
Yeah. And look, go ahead, Amber.
I was just going to add that the negative effects are also small. Okay.
Yeah.
So the Barron's and Waddington study that actually looked at participants, again, it was null effect on reading and
Right.
small negative on math. So like it's a lot of null going around, okay, and small on positive and negative.
Yeah, no, and that's important to say for sure. And look, in terms of what to do, I mean, there is the sort of hawkish view that says, well, maybe they need to kick some of these schools out of the program. They've got maybe some low performing private schools that shouldn't be in there. The more libertarian point of view may be, hey, maybe there's some really good private schools who are choosing not to participate because they found these testing requirements and other requirements too onerous. And that's an issue. If you only have a private school choice program where the most desperate private schools participate, the results are going to be worse. And of course, the fact that this is now universal and ubiquitous is going to change a lot of this, right?
That's right.
Both in terms of the studies, how we study it, and just the private schools calculus, right? If suddenly their existing parents can get a big subsidy, it's going to be very hard for them to turn that down.
Mike, I feel like we haven't had the chance to talk about this as much as we should have on the show, but I'm just curious to know, I am sort of have this concern that as vouchers are increasingly well-funded and as ESAs are increasingly well-funded, that it's increasingly hard to come up with a reason for a person to start a charter school, right? In other words, if you are, if you're interested in starting a school, you have a choice between schools that are subject to really strict forms of accountability and can be shut down if they are, if they're not performing well, or schools that basically, I don't know, there's no mechanism, right, for shutting off the money if it's not working. And I'm obviously putting my cards on the table here, but I guess it's getting harder and harder to maintain this distinction, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I mean, we're not even talking about the Supreme Court case that's about to annihilate, the distinction. But we have to answer this question, is what I'm trying to say. Like one way or the other, we have to decide either we're going to throw the doors open and try to attract the best private schools to the program by not imposing any conditions whatsoever, or we have to, in my view, we have to achieve some level of consistency across these sectors and say that the same thing that happens in the charter sector when kids aren't learning is also going to happen in the private sector, because it doesn't strike me as sustainable otherwise.
Yeah, no,
that was
obviously I do. I agree, David. Although I don't think there's any place where the funding is anywhere near. I mean, I think there's still a huge funding disparity between what the private schools are getting versus what charter schools get. And as long as that's the case, then I think plenty of people will still choose to start charter schools. But you're right. If that gap shrinks, then the calculus will change. Notice how much I keep using the term calculus. I really do love calculus.
Sure.
I guess I should refer to the statistics behind these things. All right. See, we're tying it all together, Amber. Tying it all.
Yeah, I gotcha.
All right. Very interesting. Great study, Anna and others. Thank you for bringing it to us, Amber.
Yes, indeed. Good stuff.
All right. That is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
and I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.